Everyone, thank you for being here. We'll start a little introduction right off. My name's Matt Mercier. I am the warden of the Order of the Golden Bear. This event is sponsored by the Order of the Golden Bear. And what the Order of the Golden Bear is it's a think tank for the university whose tenets are confidentiality, tolerance, and frankness. This forum that we're having today is a discussion named after Arlie Williams, who, as a student at Cal, played both baseball and football, and also served as the Dean of Men, Dean of Students, and Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs. During this time, it was very tumultuous at the university, and Mr. Williams became a central point on campus. And he always was known for having his door open and encouraging honest and frank discussion, which is what this event is doing today. And we have a very special guest today. We have Alexei Vranich. He went to Cal in his undergrad and went to the University of Pennsylvania to get his Ph.D. He currently is an affiliated researcher with the University of Texas at San Antonio, and he's been recognized by the National Science Foundation for the innovative application of technology in the study of the past. He's bridged the divide between academic and popular technology, and he's appeared on television and in magazines such as National Geographic. Please join me in welcoming Alexei and giving him a warm welcome. Incredible human being, and it's going to be a great presentation today.
Thank you very much. And here we are. Thank you very much for the introduction, Matt. I'm going to do a little share screen here to get you onto the first page, which I imagine you guys can see right now. That is correct. Fantastic. Here we go. The mind of the archaeologist. This is something that I get asked a lot as an archaeologist. Not this question, but specifically if people are going, it's like, well, what have you found, or what are you looking for? And I try to tell people that we don't actually go looking for a particular treasure or something that's lost. Some people do, but most academic archaeologists don't. What we do is essentially find fragments of the past and do some pattern recognition. Try to figure out, well, what do these little tiny fragments of the past mean, and how can we go about interpreting what it is? And I'd like to show you guys for this talk is to show you an example of the data that I use, the technology that I was able to use to take a bunch of fragments which had been really befuddling people for about 500 years and use that to make that moment, that aha moment of insight where you can actually pull everything together and find some meaning. The work that I do, here we go, where I'll be taking you to right now is actually South America, to the highlands, 13,000 feet above sea level, right on the shores of Lake Titicaca on the Bolivian side. So this is a country of Bolivia, a landlocked country, very strong indigenous presence in this country. And the culture that I've been studying is called Tiwanaku. Now I realize we don't know what the site, the ruins were called. We don't know what these people called themselves because this is all a very pre-literate period of South America. We have the Spanish conquistadors and the conquest in the 1500s, but Tiwanaku is firmly embedded in the pre-Columbian past and in the pre-literate past. They had other ways of keeping information, they just didn't write it down. And it's about 500 to 1,000 of our common era are these ruins. And here's an aerial view of Lake Titicaca, the highest navigable lake in South America, actually in the world. And we're on the southern part. And arriving into the lake, this place has been important for the entire Andes for millennia. And I show you here a picture of the sacred pilgrimage site of Copacabana in the distance. You see the two mountains. And on the left is the modern road that takes Catholic pilgrims to the site, to the sacred site. And on the bottom, you see two people walking around the old Inca highway that would take people from the Inca Empire, and even beforehand, when this was considered a very important sacred location, pre-Christian. Now it's sort of this combination of Christian and indigenous religions, a little synchronism right there. And here's a view of Lake Titicaca. I do recommend If you have not traveled in this area, do take the opportunity. This is an incredible location. And since we're in California, you could almost say this is sort of like the South American version of Lake Tahoe, but a heck of a lot higher with some incredible snow-capped mountains in the distance. And in the front, you see this grass, this reed, totora. I'll mention that later. And in the background, those are pens in the water where they actually are doing fish harvesting, salmon or trout salmon. And I just want to mention that because the best sushi I've ever had in my life has been at 13,000 feet above sea level in a landlocked country. So you got some good eating down there. Here's another shot of the lake area of Lake Titicaca. And it's very fertile. It tempers the environment a little bit, the actual waters of the lake. And you have the fishermen that go out and they all decide to pick a different color sail. So it's always a very beautiful thing in the morning when the sailors go out. And here is why my former advisor, Clark Erickson, still a present person over the University of Pennsylvania, and he did an incredible project renovating ancient agricultural beds that were around Lake Titicaca. And he showed that they were able to maintain some high levels of agriculture in a landscape that we consider somewhat desolate now. But back then, they would build these beds of elevated, here they are dried out on top, but in the bottom is the group of them renovating these raised fields, these agricultural fields, to be able to make this type of raised bed agriculture. So this area, while it seems a little bit desolate now, back in the day, during the pre-Columbian period, it was probably one of the wealthier areas of the Andes with some incredible harvests. Potato is the specialty, along with tremendous llama caravans that would have been able to carry these all across the Andes and bring back things that you couldn't get at this altitude. So this is a very wealthy area during the pre-Columbian period with some very resilient and very intuitive and innovative farmers living in the area. This is the actual site where I work, and this is, I remember when I took this is the middle of summer for me. Of course, it's South America, so we go to the south of the border, and it is bitterly cold up in this landscape. During the daytime, it could actually get warm enough that you get sunburnt and you're down to a t-shirt. In the evening, it's probably some of the coldest I've been, and I was born in Madison, Wisconsin, so I do know cold. And here we are, just the area again. Here's the southern part of Lake Titicaca, and then here's the valley of Tiwanaku, and that red area is where the ruins of Tiwanaku are located. And if you go to the town itself, it's a Spanish colonial town that was founded in the 1500s, and right in the middle, you have your typical architecture of the colonial period, but you also have this, which is a metal shield, a metal roof designed by all people by Eiffel, of Eiffel Tower fame. Actually, the French had excavated in these ruins, in the 1900s, and had brought this down as part of their museum exhibit. The local people thought it was a great idea. They dismantled it and they put it in their town plaza. So it's a strange combination of indigenous, Spanish, and French architecture when you go to this town. And it is a market town, which means that during the rest of the time, it's fairly lightly populated, but on Sunday, it just erupts in color. And you see people with their ponchos, and the person in front of you is a Malku, or one of the indigenous leaders. And he has both this red poncho, but he also has that stick on the back, which is actually his staff of office. It's also doubles as a whip, more of a ceremonial type whip. And it's a rather festive day on Sunday. I tend to visit early in the day because these folks work hard, and when it's time to relax on Sunday, they can drink a good amount of beer, and I no longer can keep up with them. But just to show you the dynamics of this area, where you have these market towns, it draws in all these people from the surrounding areas. And here's a little aerial shot. I just showed you the Pueblo de Tiwanaku, and you see a little green space there, and right there is close to the center of the town, but the ruins themselves are found all around this town area. In fact, here's an aerial view of some of the buildings, and in the background you have actually what used to be a very large pyramid or platform, In the foreground is this building called the Kalasasaya, and that means standing stone, standing sown in the Amaya language. And it was excavated and restored, and now it's the center for the solstice ceremony every year in Bolivia. And here's, in fact, a view across the ruins, and this was taken for National Geographic, and it's a very nice view of the semi-subterranean temple and the Kalasasaya in the background, with the local indigenous leaders showed up for the photograph. And in fact, it has these heads sticking out, which really draws people in. And if you saw the last Indiana Jones film, he actually is inside this temple, knocking these heads off to fall down into the big whatever spacecraft that they had for the end of the movie. Sorry about the spoilers, but he finds aliens. But he has these things when he's breaking them up. And in fact, this little head that pops out right here is causing me a tremendous amount of grief because it's original, it is archaeological, and it's always brought up as one of the mysterious heads of South America. Because they go, it's like, what built these ruins, what culture? And clearly this is an alien being depicted right here. So if you can have an argument with a piece of sculpture, me and this piece of sculpture over here do spend a lot of time arguing. So here's a view. It's flying around the site for one of these film productions at Kalasasaya. I just wanted to give you a shot of what this looked like about 150 years ago. It was very much a ruins with these stones sticking out. And here's Ephraim Squire, an American, who went down to negotiate some trade agreements in a dispute between Peru and Chile over the Guano Islands out in the Pacific. And after he'd done that, he walked through South America, recording the ruins in 1863. And here he is at Tiwanaku, or he called it the Stonehenge, the American Stonehenge, or the Baalbek of the New World. It had these tremendous stones, and just like every other explorer that came through here, he goes, why in the world is the city located here? Where is the source of these stone? And what was it? I mean, was it a city? Was it a temple? Were people living here? How long ago did they live here? And here's a shot of the same view of the excavations of this area. And you can see back in the day, judging from the way the dress in the cars, you could sort of just drive up here and walk all over it. And you ask, well, where did all the stone go that used to be at these ruins? And you can see here is the church in the town itself. And when the Spanish set up shop in South America, they stripped the ruins of stone to build, of course, the new colonial order, including the church here. So you can see in every single one of these stones in this church was taken from the ruins. So we have some difficulty here trying to recreate what this place looked like, because it's been heavily quarried in the last 500 years to build the new colonial buildings, and then afterwards, the buildings afterwards. Now on the red is where I was showing you, where you had that Kalasasaya, where they have that solstice festival. The work that I was doing, that I'm going to cover here, is that yellow arrow going all the way. When we do archaeological work, there's a lot of different ways we can do our work. We try our best not to excavate because it's expensive and it takes a long time. But we can use subsurface technology, sort of sonar, magnetism, radar, to create these images that gives us an idea of perhaps what is underground and where we can excavate. And that's extremely useful when it comes to saving our archaeological resources, because once you excavate something, you can't excavate it again. And here is specifically the place where I was excavating and doing some work, and it's called the Temple of Pumapunku. And it has some of the nicest stonework in all of South America. Here's the sides of this platform where we have the walls that would have covered the exterior. A lot has been lost during the colonial period. And you can see here's another one, and all those stones were toppled over as the Spanish were quarrying the building to take stones to create the church. So through my work, I've been able to recreate the form of this temple. And here is on the left is using a computer program, AutoCAD, where I was able to make take three-dimensional points of every little piece of architecture and then extrapolate it. And on the right, realize that this temple was the result of one temple inside of another, sort of like they created one temple, then after a while they would cover it up and create another temple on top of it. Very typical form of construction in the Americas. But the part that really fascinated people was right here with the red arrow, and it's this area right here, which has some of the largest stonework in the continent. And in fact, the people are standing on a block of sandstone, which I think weighs about 80 tons or so. And there is no source in the immediate area of where the stone came from. We now know it came from about 15 kilometers away, and this was dragged to this location. And remember, this is the pre-Columbian period, so we don't have iron, we don't have draft animals. They really didn't use the wheel either. I don't know how you could use a wheel when you have a block that weighs 80 tons. But the other things that are here, in addition to these huge blocks, are these very nice blocks made out of andesite. It's a volcanic rock, sort of like a granite. And here's a few examples that are sitting on top of this sandstone. And they have very, very precise corners, and they're held together using these clamps. In fact, there were poured metal into these things to hold the stones together. So it has a lot of technology which people are very much interested in and wonder. Here's photographs from 1893 where such huge blocks were brought from, and what did this look like? You can see on the actual blocks themselves, the foundations, little cutouts, which were probably locations where the superstructure, the building, was set. And here are some of the blocks that would have been part of this building. And these are the famous H stones. And if you type in H stones Bolivia, or H stones, you can just leave it at that on the internet, you'll find an entire range of strange and innovative ideas as to what these stones were used for. Again, remember, no iron, copper, bronze, arsenic, copper is probably the hardest thing. How did they create these stones that look so absolutely perfect? Including, here's one where you have this iconic doorway within a doorway within a doorway within another doorway in a hole. And this is represented throughout the site of Tiwanaku, asking, well, what exactly were these people trying to represent? And what was their ideology? And some of these stones are extremely well cut. Here's one on the right where you can see not only does it have those beautiful internal right angles, but in one of the hardest stones on Earth, they have these drill holes going all the way through, which would have held some type of plate, something we just don't quite know what it would have done. And of course, people lose their minds when they see this. You always have people going like, look how incredibly precise it is. You have other strange ideas on how they moved some of these stones, which is always a fertile place for the speculative minds, including here's a reconstruction of what they think it would have looked like. And this is actually a rather frightening reconstruction because it was actually published 1939 in Berlin, and shows the influence of the interwar fascist modern architecture movement. It looks very much like one of the buildings from the Third Reich, which actually ended up influencing. And when it comes to the actual archaeology of it, and if you do type in Pumapunku, and this is something I've had to deal with my entire life. Let's see this little bit.
Pumapunku is the only site on planet Earth that, in my opinion, was built directly by extraterrestrials.
And this is fantastic because at least once a month, I get a call or somebody wanting to know about the site. Either they're very inquisitive, or the folks from Ancient Aliens contact me about every year, or different styles of programs contact me, ask me if I could say something. And I go, guys, I cannot go on Ancient Aliens. Congratulations to you all. It's been 14 seasons and you've been doing great, but I can't go on Ancient Aliens. And if you do type in Pumapunku into Google search, Pumapunku Ancient Technology, Advanced Ancient, you know, it keeps going on and on and on. So what is this incredible fascination with this site when it comes to these fringe ideas? And here's a view. There I am standing on one of the large blocks, and you can see the andesite, those green stones in the background. Now, how did it get here? All the way from, because the andesite is located those greenish blocks are actually located on the other side of the lake. And that's an earlier project I did for another television program. You can even watch it on YouTube. It's called Voyage to the American Stonehenge, where I said, well, there's no real trees at this altitude, but they do have this long tradition of using the Totora reeds that I showed you in one of the first pictures to create boats. And you can put these reeds together, and make yourself a rather large boat. So for one program, we actually spent the entire summer creating one of these large boats to go about moving one of these blocks from one side of the lake to the other, and actually a 10-ton stone. And here we are actually with this giant Totora reed boat, 40 feet long, 12 feet across, 12 tons, that we built. And then we did an experimental archaeology style experiment where we took one block, and you can see on the right, there we are with the Bolivian Navy, of all people, helping us out. I believe that's the entire Bolivian Navy. They still maintain a presence even though they lost their coastline. Great kids. And we moved a 10-ton stone from one side of the lake to the other using this technology, which was just basically done by a family of about 8 people weaving these grasses together. So what about actually fitting this together? Now, you do have a very eminent scholar over at UC Berkeley. He just recently retired Pierre Protzen from the architecture department. And he spent a long period of time, right around the same time I was there, also looking at these stones and going, well, how do they actually fit together? And he came up with several ideas. And this comes from spending hours and hours looking at these stones and having a mind of the architect. And here's actually the stone itself that the Bolivians decide to fit together and place on top of the platform. Now, here I am with the Nat Geo folks, and we have all of these stones. And the idea is, how exactly do we go about putting this together? We can draw these things. We did several attempts using some high technology and laser scanners, but it still completely befuddled us how all these fit together, and how do you go about actually addressing such a fragmentary building that was completely destroyed. And from looking at the remains, it was probably never even finished. So we're almost looking for the intent of the architect to build something 1,000 years ago from a culture we don't know about, or any other type of architectural forms to base it on. Now, as archaeologists, we spend a lot of time with tiny, tiny little fragments, in particular, small little fragments of ceramics. And we like to put numbers on each one of these as we take our data. And here's just a typical lab with just the amount of ceramics that you find. Because once you break a piece of ceramic, it's there forever. You can make it so much smaller, but you'll still always have ceramics on the surface. And you can actually put these things together and with some care, and actually it becomes a very mindful, calming project of putting some of these sherds back together to create their original forms. Now, this is easy when it comes to, well, not easy, but it's feasible when it comes to something small like a pot. Now, what do you do when you have a giant building with 10-ton stones? And this is where I was able to find the archives of all the previous scholars that went through this site and made these drawings of these stones that were shattered. And here's Léon Sangran from 1848. This was in the archives in France. And here are his drawings with very precise measurements. There's some of the H-stones, which are also drawn out and always drawing a great amount of interest. Here's Alphonse Stubel from 1873. He went through there, and then it got redone into a publication in 1893. And you can see that he also has some very precise measurements of these stone blocks that were scattered around the site. And Jean-Pierre Protzen from our dear Cal also went and made very detailed recordings of each and one of these stones down to about millimeter accuracy. And here are several examples from his notebooks, which he was gracious to lend and make part of the permanent collection at Cal. And using that, I actually sat down with undergrads. Now, this is something that when I do teach, I value the the work and the insight that our undergraduates have. And I said, let's make these notes, both Pierre Protstin's, but the other ones from a century ago, and let's make it into three-dimensional form. So we sat down, and for an entire semester, we went through creating these 3D forms on the computer using a program SketchUp, very easy program to make 3D forms. And you can see on the right, there's one of the H stones. On the bottom one is another very elaborate stone that I'll get to in a moment. And we were able to go through a lot of these fragments. Good Lord, how many do we do? We did about 100 or so. We still have at least 100 and more to go, but we had enough of these to start getting an idea of what exactly were they building and how were they trying to put it together. This is almost like getting a package from IKEA, except you don't have the instructions and some of the pieces are missing and you really don't know what it looks like. So you can go about it going like, how are we going to go and try to fit these all together? Well, our first step was to take a picture from 1893 and then recreate what it looked like at least a century ago before it started getting moved around a little bit more. Perhaps that gave us an idea of where these stones came from. If they're lying on this ground, the idea is, well, they didn't move too far from their original location. So there's a photograph from 1893, and there's our virtual reconstruction of all those stones in the place where they would have been. From there, the technology took a little bit of a jump a few years ago with 3D printing technologies. And here's one of the gateways, or one of the doorways that would have been in this temple. And we brought it into another program, just for the hay of telling you, MeshLab, which makes sure that it's completely watertight. And from here, it gets brought up into a program and dropped into a 3D printer. And in this case, we were using, instead of plastic, which you see a lot of 3D printing being done, we're using almost like a plaster of Paris. So over the course of a few hours, it was dropping little tiny bits of dust exactly on the location that we said it should go according to the 3D model. And then eventually, when it was done, we had the pieces inside of the loose dust. And we carefully, because it's very fragile at this point, took the dust off and then used an airbrush to make them clean. And at this point, they're still very friable. And this is a cyanoacrylate infiltration. Essentially, it's crazy glue. That's what we did. We just simply poured crazy glue on it. And by doing that, it consolidates it and it turns it almost into something that feels like a piece of marble. And that's actually quite important because when we did it in plastic, it felt light and cheap. It didn't feel very appealing, but when we made it this way, it felt like an actual stone, and it really invited you to spend time sort of flipping them around and feeling it and holding it in your hand. And you realize every time you picked up one of these pieces, and here we are with all the pieces sort of spread out in front of us, every time you picked it up, you were essentially getting information into your brain, maybe even the unconscious part, the subconscious part of your brain about each one of these pieces. And what I did, since I was living in the dormitory with the students, is that I had this out on my desk or in my living room all the time. It's sort of like that puzzle that you get for Thanksgiving to do something to avoid the relatives or over Christmas time, and you don't sort of like finish it up and you hit a point where you just can't go any further. The next day you walk by it and all of a sudden, boom, you fit one piece, you fit another, you fit another, you fit another. And that's sort of the process of making a puzzle. And in this case, I had it laying out there in front of me so that I could also have that same moment. So when I'd wake up in the morning, I'd be looking at these pieces with my cup of coffee and I would see, can I make any type of associations? And here they are with the students, actually in the apartment, in the dormitories. And there they are modeling some more of the stones with these stones out here in front. And here they are as we try to figure out maybe this category belongs here, this category belongs here. And we try to fit them together during the day. And in the background, you can see my cat, which was a very important part of this process because the cat would then just sort of stand and lie down on top of things. And then during the evening, it would just grab these pieces and just sort of knock them over. So in the morning, anything that I'd put together would probably be knocked over by the cat. And this is an important part of the process of thinking about fragments and looking for patterns. You can't get too enamored with what you think is a pattern that you just found, because there's a good chance that you're wrong. But archaeologists and other people that are involved in looking and try to reconstruct just the world from fragmentary patterns have to realize you have to take a step back. And before you decide that's how it is, take it apart again, try it again. Do not get enamored with your narrative, and see if you can keep actually taking it apart and looking at it with fresh eyes each day. And that's how my cat ended up helping me out, was keeping myself honest and not becoming too much in love with one idea, having it destroyed and then putting it together. And more than once, something that I felt was an accomplishment, I would later look and I go, actually, those pieces don't fit. And it's painful because you realize you just spent an entire day doing something and got nothing out of it. But you are actually getting more and more information inside of your head. And in particular, this piece right here, which I showed you a 3D model of before, Jean-Pierre Protzen, he had taken a look at this and said, well, actually, this piece, and there's this publication, is a reproduction. The Tiwanaku made a big temple, but they also made a tiny temple for some reason. They made a smaller version of the temple, sort of a miniature. And they had these pieces out, and you go, these actually all belong to a miniature version of one of these temples. And laid out in two-dimensional plan, from you can see from the publication, it looks like a facade that goes across the front of the temple, perhaps. And here's the pieces reproduced in virtual form. And on top, on the left, is a mini gateway of this mini temple. And to the right is actually a large scale or full scale size of one of the doorways of the temple. I realized this was actually reduced 0.57, the height of the original temple. So that one piece that had all of the windows and doorways was actually a representation of how you could put several of these pieces together to form a complete wall. And there's Jean-Pierre Protzen's reconstruction of how some of these stones, including those famous H stones, would have fit together. And I had the same thing, continuing to work off of his insight. I spent a lot of time with these pieces, and I put them together, and you can see they do fit. There's that molding that goes all the way across, and you're holding, and I'm wondering, it's like, what did this thing look like? What did this look like? And then one morning, I was just sitting there, and I realized, oh, that's what it does. I was looking at it as a flat plane, and all of a sudden, I was able to realize, use it in 3 dimensions and fold it over. And I realized I had the corner of a building. I can't tell you how hard this insight was. Right now, in hindsight, it seems very obvious, but for the last few hundred years, people have been looking at it in just one way. And once we had that one piece folded over, other pieces started coming into the puzzle. And I was able to piece this together from one piece to another to start recreating the form of this miniature building, which was a representation of one of the larger buildings on site. And through the virtual modeling, I was able to recreate, this is what one of these buildings would have looked like from this. And it's a very odd building. You have the doorway going in to a room that had 31 separate small little representations of windows and doors. So clearly the people in Tiwanaku were obsessed with this idea of gateways or passages from one side to another. And here's just sort of a nicer version as we created this for more presentations and publications. Now, I published this in Heritage Journal, which is not something, Heritage Science, which is not something that you consider to be very accessible to the public, but it quickly went to #1 of their outputs in the 99th percentile, top 5% of all articles. And what happened was this study went viral, actually. It got covered by 40 different agencies around the world, talking about the reconstruction using 3D printing to recreate this temple. And here's some of the various different places that covered it. And some very legitimate ones, Archaeology, Science News, Live Science, Sci News, Science Daily. So it got covered by very legitimate places. The 3D printing market loved it, to the point that I'm still getting invitations for new 3D printing technologies and so on. And I keep telling them, listen, I used the 3D printing. I don't know what polymers or whatever the hey you guys are going to be using here. I just simply used this and I just gave it to the specialist and he printed it out. And then it got very popular in Russia. The name of Alexei Vranich. I figured they thought like a local hero was brought in and figured out how to do this here. My background is Serbian, and the first name was because my mother liked Russian history. So there's all this coverage across the old Soviet Union. I did like the fact that Puzzle Nation, one of these blog sites, actually picked up this study, an ancient Indian jigsaw puzzle. And then it went everything from live science, which is ancient architects, alien architects didn't build these pre-Incan complexes, to ancient origins, talking about it. So the same group of people, from the fringe scientists to the more sober ones, could find this. And then it was interesting how things just kept changing as time goes on. Scientists virtually reconstruct 1500-year-old Bolivian temple. Scientists virtually reconstruct magnificent pre-Incan temple. Scientists magnificently reconstruct the magnificent temple of the Incas. It sort of kept changing a little bit as it went over. And my name went through all types of variations. It started off as Alexei, then it turned Alexei Vranich, then it turned into Alexei Panic, which is not too bad. To the final ones, and I think I was being referred to as Fran Nicky, who's also a heavy metal singer. So then there was all types of confusion. But looking at our upcoming elections, this is two things both the right and the left could agree on. The pre-Inca temple, magnificently recreate the temple. There's a Republican and a Democratic newspaper covering both of these things. And then of course there's some translations that I just could not understand. The whole process is like high music. I don't know what that means, but it became very popular also in China, where I believe the Google Translate is not as good. So here's one of the sort of more to the sober models of the reconstruction of this. And this is one of these moments that you live for as an archaeologist. Yes, you know, there are cool finds. And people ask me, it's like, what's the most interesting thing you've ever found? And I do have one moment at the site of Tiwanaku where we excavated and found a sacrificial pit located along the solstice line from the temple, and it had 18 different people that had been sacrificed and thrown into it. And I brought in my forensic friend, John Verano from Tulane University, and he excavated over just a month-long period and reconstructed all the gory details of the sacrifice. And that's one story. Now, it was an interesting find, but when you come to a realization and you actually peer into the mind of somebody from the past, that's an interesting moment. And this is how we had this model. When we took a look at the model and we actually started rotating it, and if one was to be standing where that person was, we realized here it is using the 3D model. You're looking through the gateway, but you change focus. Here's the gateway. In the background, there's another gateway, there's another gateway, there's another gateway inside of another. So essentially, you're looking into infinity by looking into a single room. They're using forced perception to give the impression that you're looking off into the horizon, off into the far distance. And that was what was being represented with one of these stones. And the moment that we were able to look at this and go, it's like, oh, good Lord, they're using just within this small little 10 by 10 room, they create the impression that you can look off into infinity. It's like looking into the very cosmos or the ideology of these people. And an interesting thing was when I put this together, I just couldn't sleep that night. I really couldn't sleep at night because I had finally put back together this temple and was able to peer into the experience of what people would have considered to be the sacred center of the world. And when those students that I showed you in the previous picture, they showed up, one of them showed up, in fact, and he looked disheveled. And he looks at me and he goes, I couldn't sleep last night. He goes, neither could I. It was such an exciting moment when you're able to recreate something like this. So here we are with this technology. In this case, it allowed me to work, and I continue to work at the site. trying to piece these together. But also, I'd like to see how well we can use this technology in other places, whether it be modern disasters like ISIS taking over the ruins of Palmyra, and how those ruins are going to be recreated to places just throughout the classical world, where just time and those factors have created these ruins with a lot of pieces, to now some more recent work I'm doing in Angkor. I'm still using this technology to take the entire world and reduce it to the size of something that you can hold in your hand. And once you have it in your hand, you can spin it around as much as you like and see if you can piece it together. And if you're lucky, you'll have one of those aha moments where these pieces fit together and you're able to recreate a vision of the past. With that, thank you very much for your attention. I'll be taking right now questions, but directed through our coordinator, Matt Mercier, for any questions that you'd like to ask.
Thank you, Alexei. So if anyone has questions, feel free to type it up in the chat. And if you want to also raise your hand, I'll select from both. In the meantime, while we're waiting for questions, Alexei, you have a book that you're writing, correct?
That is correct, yes. I have to finish up this book by the 2nd of January about the ruins of Tiwanaku.
Nice.
University of Florida Press, and it's been several years of work on it, so hopefully it'll be done, as all good academic publications are difficult to do and get through.
Very true. We're excited to get a hold of that as well. We have a question in the chat. Who paid for this archaeological expedition, and were local people involved in the reconstruction?
Now, who paid for it and were local people involved? Well, as academic and archaeologists, you do absolutely everything humanly possible to get funds. And this was sponsored by the National Science Foundation, National Geographic, 2 large grants from National Science Foundation. But also in the case of the Reed boat, that was actually sponsored by the film company. And then also we do rely heavily on private donations from interested individuals, especially when grants run out or something happens. Those are the funds that allow us to continue doing our research. Now, I'm very much involved with the local people. At one point, we had 170 people from the local Aymara villages, 23 different communities working for us. These are their ruins, so they are stakeholders and form part of it. And I'm very happy to be able to go down there and to pay these people justly and on time, and be able to inject a little bit of money into one of the poorest areas of Bolivia, which is one of the poorest countries in the hemisphere. So this was a very important source of income for the local people.
Thank you, Alexei. That was from Lorraine McLean. And now we have a question from Charles Darrow. Professor, which sites are you currently working on with this reconstructive technology?
Oh, what sites am I working on right now? I continue to work at the site of Tiwanaku using this technology. And then the other site where I just recently was Angkor Wat in Cambodia. And that site is also a spectacular archaeological ruin that's also in many, many different pieces for a variety of different reasons. Unfortunately, with the present world situation we have right now, most of the research has been put on hold. But that's the other site I'm working at, and I hope to be able to use this technology at other archaeological sites in the classical world, actually.
And hopefully I'm pronouncing names correctly. The next question is from V. Bestre. Have you tried working with mathematicians to optimize assemblies of individual pieces based on structural models and law of physics rather than trial and error?
There we go. Have I tried to use this using any type of algorithms for programs? Actually, Stanford did a pilot program a few years ago where they tried to use algorithms and computer processing to put together the Servian map of Rome. This is a map that was a large marble wall that had the entire city mapped out and is fragmentary. And I wanted to see, could the computer actually find those pieces and put it together? Same thing what people have done when it comes to pottery, ceramics, pottery pieces, to see if you can put it together. Unfortunately, the technology is simply not there yet. The human mind is just better at taking three-dimensional pieces and floating them around and sticking it back together. We may reach a point where we actually do have a technology that allows us to fit it, but even under the best of circumstances, it'll take the computer a lot of processing time, and we have a lot of false identifications, which means you still have to go through and look at them individually as a person and pick up the pieces. This technology, using the as a jigsaw puzzle, was a quick way to get at that part of the brain where we visualize 3D space. Someday in the future, I think it'll be possible. At the moment, not just yet.
We have a question from C. Matthews asking, do you have a recommended website? Where can we read more about your work?
Oh, you can go to www.dralexei.com and you can see some of the films that I've done. You can see additional work on the 3D reconstruction. And here, there's even a complete lecture with PowerPoints and associated documentary if anyone is in the teaching world and would like to have this. By the way, I have taught this class to elementary school kids. And when it came to the tutorial reed boats, we all got straws afterwards and made our little boats and floated them in the water. So it's also something fun for the whole family. But yes, please check out my site. With that being said, I'm going to rush to that site and update some of the links. Go ahead.
So I just sent that link out in the chat as well. So if everyone,
fantastic,
you can have that. Another question from Lorraine was, what did your finding that this was a doorway to infinity tell you about the spiritual beliefs of the people there?
Wow, what did it tell you about the spiritual beliefs? Now, it's how do you represent the divine? How do you represent the numinous? An encounter with something which is ineffable. It cannot be described. I found this very interesting that they decided to represent something which is unrepresentable because it can't be comprehended, as all good religious phenomena, by something which is also very difficult to represent, which is a concept of infinity. That I found very interesting, how they used a concept to express another concept. There are other aspects of the ideology of the people of Tiwanaku where they used representations of mythical animals to represent the heavens, our planes, and below, using things like that, such as the condor, the snake, frogs, and catfish for the area below. So it does fall within the cosmology, but this specific incident of using infinity to represent the divine is something I've never ever seen before in South or actually in this continent. Hard answer, because it's a hard question. We'll always be trying to define that.
And some more questions from the chat, and if anyone's wondering where the chat is, the chat function is located next to the share screen button, right in the middle of the bottom of Zoom. The next question is from Gilbert. Did you go to the quarries and find any interesting pieces that might have been a miscut, or did those likely get used for later buildings?
Oh, did I go to the quarries? Check it out. Yes, we did. There's one thing in the Andes that you'll see, and one of the reasons we figured out, or it was figured out even before us, where they came from was because a line of piedras cansadas, which means tired stones. And that's the idea that these stones were going to the site and they got tired and they just sort of stopped and laid there. It's the idea that the stone and the entire earth is actually still alive. So you do have these stones that are in process along that route from the quarries all the way over to the actual ruins themselves. And you do find the tools, hammer stones mostly, that they would have used to reduce some of these stones to something more manageable before they were dragged off. But yes, we do have an understanding of where these stones came from.
Next question from David Staples. Do the ruins have writing similar to Mayan pictographs? And if so, have they been deciphered?
Now, do they have anything similar to the Maya? Unfortunately, had this lecture been several decades ago, we would have said the Maya were pre-literate. But with a very famous conference over in Washington a few decades ago, they realized, no, in fact, that is writing. In the case of Tiwanaku, we do have some very elaborate carvings that do represent some very sophisticated concepts of ritual and religious space and ideas, but we don't have anything that we can consider writing. So I don't think we'll be deciphering anything in the near future.
A question from Anne Lage. How did they make such exact right angles?
How do they make exact right angles? Well, there's a couple of ways to do that, which is using either metal or even obsidian, which is volcanic glass. Now, how they actually made it and made sure that they got each one right, I'm not exactly sure. But what they were doing is essentially making what we call a skiomorph. And that's when you take something which is impermanent, such as mud wall or adobe, and make it into something permanent using stone. That's how the Greek temples used to be made of wood, then they got turned into marble, but they still maintain some of the decorative aspects of when it used to be wood. In this case, they were trying to imitate an adobe building, and they were creating adobes, but using stone and making these angles that they would have been able to make very precisely when it came to the adobe themselves. They would have had some type of template or something to put over the stone where they could mark it out. And in fact, we have some stones that are just starting to be processed by the people, and then they were left. And you can see the lines on them, which would have been their guides for which areas they were to be to carve out. Now, it would have taken a lot of time, but one thing that people had back then was a lot of time. And remember, this temple was never actually finished too.
If anyone has any more questions, feel free to put it in the chat. In the meantime, I was wondering, Alexei, what, in your opinion, was the most groundbreaking technology used in archaeology? Is it the sonar, the magnetism, 3D printing, virtual modeling? What to you is the most groundbreaking?
What's the most groundbreaking? When, in the large historical sense, you'd have to say that carbon dating was revolutionary in the mid-20th century. And we were able to go from trying to date things by their style to actually be able to find yourself a range of dates. And that really turned over a lot of ideas as soon as we got some secure dating. And the dating technology is getting better and better. So we're able to use it with less errors. Perhaps, a few decades ago, you would have gotten a carbon date plus or minus 200 years. You're like, oof, that's not that great. Now you can get it down plus or minus 20 years, which means you can start getting some very precise dates on when they were doing things and even correlating with historical records for later periods. So carbon dating, very important. The other aspect that's being used a lot more is something which allows us to look underground. Or at least notice the ground. That's everything from LiDAR, which can detect the topography even through dense jungles, to the sonar equipment, the magnetism that I showed in the slide that allows you to take a large area and not have to excavate it all to get an understanding of what's there. Maybe then you go into excavations, but excavations are expensive and time consuming. So anything that keeps us away from that is a good thing. So there's two ideas right there, and who knows what the world will bring in the next few years when it comes to archaeological science.
A couple more questions from the chat.
Sure.
Asks, why was the temple unfinished? Do we know anything about what happened to the people working on it?
Why was the temple unfinished? Now, back before carbon dating, people would have said it's like they were making this beautiful temple and then they were surprised by invaders or there was a disaster and they left it. Now with carbon dating, we realized it was a very early temple and they were making it. And then they decided to not continue with it. Now, why they decided to leave it alone and never finish it, you figure it's like, oh, something bad happened. No, actually something really good happened. The site became very popular and a lot of people started arriving. So instead of putting all their energy into making one small temple, they started making large plazas and big facades. Think of almost something like a Disneyland. So they started making these things that, if you look at it, they're actually sort of poorly made. But once they would have been covered with paint and textiles and so on, it would have been an impressive setting. But the construction was quicker. So in a way, the site went viral, or their marketing went viral. And when that happened, they sort of became a big franchise, and they needed to create something which could accept a lot more people. And they left that small but very elaborate temple on the side. It really couldn't accommodate a lot of people. Now, what happened to this place? Well, all empires, all societies, all religions, they all eventually do collapse. Now, why it actually fell apart, we honestly don't know. We know at one point they stopped building. They even start making sacrifices of people, but instead of putting them in the proper places, they're just sort of putting them next to the temple and covering them up with a bit of dirt. And then about 1000 AD, the place just is sort of abandoned. Now we can bring in archaeologists from all different styles of thought, and we can come up with one idea for every archaeologist in the room. The nature of collapse is very difficult to define, and what exactly caused it. So I would say we don't know, and I think I can say that with confidence that we don't know.
The next question is from Charles. Speaking of dating technology, what is the latest opinion of the age range at Tiwanaku?
The latest opinion for the age range. Now, the latest opinion would, of course, be my opinion in that sense. And it looks like we have the site being occupied with a small temple, the one with the head sticking out of it. Perhaps that dates to 300 BC. And now with the most recent carbon dates actually pulled from collagen, from the teeth of the individuals that were left as sacrifices along the pyramid. That dates to about the 10th century, so 900s or so. Perhaps the apogee of this place, Tiwanaku, perhaps lasted from maybe 650 to 950, which for the New World is a substantial amount of time for a place that seemed to be run mostly on the creation of spectacle and experience for visiting pilgrims.
Seeing if there's any more questions. If not, we've only got a couple minutes left. So kind of as a closing question, Alexei, when will we be seeing you on Ancient Aliens in the near future?
You will not be seeing me on Ancient Aliens. I do believe I just spent an entire day being one of the talking heads on Histories, Mysteries, Decoded or something. I don't know. Just use those words and move them around in one direction or another if you like, and you can come up with it. Fortunately, they sent me the script ahead of time, and while the title of it seems a little bit spectacular, their research is solid. So you'll see me every once in a while. For those of you that have insomnia, just go through the later channels in cable station, and every once in a while I'll pop up there doing something or another. By the way, television pays terribly. I do it because it's fun and allows me to have additional material to show my students. So please see me in the future on late night cable television.
With that, I want to thank Alexei Vranich for being our guest today. And also thank you to the donors at UC Berkeley. Thank you to Alexei for everything he's done for the University of California, Berkeley as a professor, as an advisor, as a student here. He's continued his work as a professor at Berkeley, at MIT, and across the country. And also thank you to the Early Williams family for sponsoring this discussion. And we hope you'd enjoy. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you much, and go Bears.
Go Bears.